Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. I'm a human who cares about supporting other humans. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We'll unpack the experience with them, where they've been stuck, what it feels like, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others. I believe that when we feel more connected and seen, magic can happen. And remember, if you find yourself sitting on a comma in your life, you can also talk to me without a microphone. To explore coaching with me and getting off the comma in your own life, check out my information and book a call with me at offthecomma.com. And I'm also doing something different. I'm curating my own sponsor community, local businesses and professionals who I handpick and who align with our vision here. Be sure to check them out, learn more about them on my website and my YouTube channel. In the meantime, let's get into this week's conversation. And we are back with another exciting episode of Off the Comma, and we are sliding close to our 100th episode. So that's pretty darn exciting, and more to come on what 100 episodes is going to mean for Off the Comma and for me and for us at another time. But this week, we continue our conversations. We continue our powerful storytelling. We continue the work that I feel so passionately about, and all of the brave folks who come here to tell their stories feel passionately about, which is normalizing the experience of sitting on a comma, being able to share our stories, in a judgment-free and safe zone, and for the purposes of sharing the stories, and to also kind of demonstrate, what listening looks like. And so I'm very excited and very proud that we continue to do this kind of work. And we get to do it this week with another kind of new friend of mine, if you will. Lucy Hall is with us this week. I'm going to let her introduce herself in just a moment. But I will very much be looking forward to getting to know Lucy and kind of meeting her more through the story that she's going to share with us today. And Lucy is another one of my guests who we have a couple of things in common. I'll let her kind of share what she's all about in a moment, but we have some things in common. And then she's also another one of my guests who is coming to us from another country outside of the United States, which is very important to me for this podcast, is that we're hearing voices, we're hearing all kinds of voices, and we're hearing voices from all over the planet. So with that, I will stop my rambling. I do that every single episode, and I always kind of say I'm going to stop. But anyway, Lucy, welcome to the podcast. And why don't you tell us about yourself? Why don't you start with, like we always do, how would you like to be known? And then you can kind of go into what would you like us to know about you?
Right. Well, hello. My name is Lucy. I would like to be known as someone who brought people together. I'm very enthusiastic about other people and bringing people together from different walks of life who might not have connected if they hadn't met me or been part of a group that I've formed and led. So that's what I'd like to be known for.
Nice. What other words would you use to kind of describe yourself as a person? One of the things we do on the podcast is, it's all about us being human beings together. And so that's kind of why I asked the question too. It's like, if you think about yourself as a human being, obviously we all are, like, what are a couple of words you would use to describe yourself as a human?
I'm enthusiastic. I think it's safe to say that's one of the things that people always say, you're so enthusiastic about this and you're so enthusiastic about other things you're telling me about. So enthusiastic, positive, definitely, and open-minded.
Okay. Nice. Well, and I'm looking forward to seeing how those traits and characteristics kind of reveal themselves in your story. What else would you like folks to know about you? Your interests, hobbies, family.
So I'm mum of two gorgeous children. My daughter is 12 and my son is 10. And my husband is the most wonderful, long-suffering. He's kind of in the position of your traditional 1950s housewife. Like, he looks after everything. I work longer hours than he does. And he, on top of all that, cooking, cleaning, getting the kids to their hobbies, all that emotional labor, he is by far and away better at me than better than me at those things, and I'm constantly trying to remember that and acknowledge that and be grateful for that. I have tried to help by actually doing more household things, but that upsets his system. And
Mm.
he's like, I'd rather you just, really acknowledged me and showed that I'm appreciated and let me do it all.
It sounds like he enjoys his job, and
He
he
does,
has,
yeah.
like you said, he's got his systems in place. And so I love the fact that you mentioned that, because it's all work.
Mhm.
How or if we get paid for it and how much we get paid for it really doesn't have anything to do with the degree, magnitude, effort required of work, right? It's all work. It's all important.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's my family setup. And then also I'm very close to my extended family. So my mum and stepdad live just a few miles away, and my kids are going to my mum's right now for their dinner, which they do every Thursday, which is just a lovely way to connect the generations and keep, have extra adults who really care about them and are close to them in their lives. And my dad and stepmom also live just a very short distance away, and they all get on with each other. So we have big extended family holidays, sometimes with my brother and sister-in-law and my nephew and niece, who are the same age as my kids. So we are really lucky to all live close. The kids are all the same age, they're all close friends. I feel very, very privileged, and I realize how lucky I've been to have divorced parents who are
Mm.
good friends now. They weren't always close, but they were always, on reasonably good terms. And then, they've married people who accept the situation and get on with each other. And that I think is a big part of bigger than I realize, I think, actually, in
Mm.
keeping me stable and safe and having people to talk to when things aren't great. So that's a big part of what I do. And then in terms of how I earn a living, I am a teacher. I've only just gone back into teaching after a period of self-employment following burnout, which I will probably talk about later.
Mhm.
But I have found a part-time job in a school that is right for me, which I never ever dreamed I would be able to do at the height of my, burnout situation. So, yeah, I'm proud to say I'm 2 weeks back into being a teacher, and I also have
Mm.
a small sober coaching practice. And I tutor young athletes who want to balance achieving their academic potential without, with succeeding academically. So they don't want to give up sport to pass their exams. They don't want to sacrifice their grades, and they also don't want to burn out or sacrifice their well-being. And so after
Mm.
several years of school leadership, I have built up a toolkit of strategies to help young people achieve that I used to deliver to whole year groups. And
Mhm.
now I do that through
Okay.
sports clubs and with private clients one-to-one. So that's what I was doing when I was self-employed. But then this perfect teaching job came up. So now I'm learning to balance employment and self-employment.
Nice. Well, and I can hear how important family is to you, support systems, and it sounds like this theme of burnout kind of has a thread that runs through things. So let's get into your story here in just a second. Before we get to the 5 questions, one of the things I ask every guest is, Lucy, as you think ahead to the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, what intention would you have for yourself in sharing your story today?
What I'm really hoping is that some part of what I say helps somebody to move forward positively if they are stuck in their life. And it might be that they
Hmm.
have a similar issue like burnout, or their relationship with alcohol, or their relationship with their body and health and fitness, all of which are things I've spent a lot of time working on. Or it might just be, how I speak about this issue of male and female roles in the home, because I've given that a lot of thought. So I just would hope that something I say can help someone move forward positively.
Okay. All right. My intention, Lucy, today is to support you in your intention, create a space where you can share your story, and that in bringing this story out there to other people, there will be folks who will see a little bit of themselves in you and in your story. And in so doing, it will help them feel a little bit more connected, a little bit less alone. And in the best of cases, maybe even feel inspired or empowered to go out and do something that they've been wanting to do.
Absolutely.
Let's dive into it then. The first question, Lucy, is where in your life have you found yourself sitting on a comma?
So a few years ago, I had moved so I'm from West Yorkshire, which is in the north of England, and from a city called Bradford, which is an area of quite high deprivation and has a really large Muslim population. We're Britain's, I think, Europe's youngest city. So lots of young people, very entrepreneurial city, partly because of the largely Pakistani heritage community who are very, they either want to go into generally the families I've worked with, they either want their children to go into a profession like the law or medicine, or they want them to start their own business. So that's where I grew up. I was lucky enough to go to private school. So from the age of 11, I went to a fee-paying school because the local state school was kind of in crisis. And I went there, and my parents were teachers, and realised that it was not a great place for me or for any child, really. So I had sort of this kind of mixed upbringing in this area of quite high deprivation, but I went to a really nice school and had lovely friends, and we lived in a decent area. It was kind of, sort of 3-bedroom semi-detached houses with a garden, and wasn't high luxury, but absolutely not in any kind of underprivileged setting. And I was very, very academic at school, and I remember a lot of times being asked by teachers and family, like, what do you want to do when you're older? And it was always like, I'm going to be a barrister. There was a long period where I wanted to be prime minister, but then I found out the prime minister was not actually the highest paid person in the country, which I thought made no sense at all. And once I found that out, I wasn't interested at all. And I had a lot of, you might say, smoke blown up my arse, as we say in England. Like, I was boosted a lot in my self-confidence about how I was going to have this amazing career and I was going to do something great. It was always a bit vague what that was, but it was definitely going to be amazing because I was a good girl and I worked hard at school and I was going to do great things. And I went to Oxford University. I was lucky enough to go there, and I studied classics, so Latin and Greek and philosophy and ancient history, which was wonderful, but not pointing in any particularly obvious direction career-wise. And so one point where I found myself sat on a comma was towards the end of university. It was a bit like, I have achieved the only thing I ever really wanted, which was to go to a top university and study ancient things. And that I've done that now. So what next? So I managed to spin it out another year by securing funding to do a master's in ancient history at Oxford. So I stayed and did that. But then it was like, right, I don't want to do a PhD. I do not want to sit alone in a library and become the world expert on something that nobody else knows about. A PhD in ancient history is very lonely. And I didn't know if I had what it takes anyway, intellectually, to go that far with it. So started looking around and was genuinely stuck. Like, I didn't have the money to train as a barrister. That's really expensive. Back then you had to do effectively an almost unpaid internship in London. And there was just no way that was going to happen. We didn't have the money for that. So I just didn't know what to do. I wanted to train as a teacher because I knew my skill set and my personality would lend itself well to that. But my parents had been teachers, and the education system in Britain has been kind of sliding down into a pretty bad state for a long time. And my parents were like, please don't do that. We don't want to sit back and watch you go into this profession that we are desperately trying to get out of through retirement. Well, my dad wasn't a teacher by this point. He'd already managed to escape into the private sector. But my mum was like, just please don't. I know it looks fun, but it's really not. So I was like, okay, I'll give that a miss. So I ended up taking an internship in Procter & Gamble, big US firm, makes lots and lots of household products. And I decided that, well, okay, if I'm going to move away from these classical ruins, I'm going to go into IT. I'm going to be really modern and cutting edge. But didn't enjoy it. But Procter & Gamble had a great corporate social responsibility project called Go, Give and Grow back then. We're talking like early 2000s. So I got to go to Geneva and work at the World Health Organization on an internship. And that was great fun. And I got to work on tuberculosis control and World TB Day and various global projects. And TB is a disease of poverty. So that gave me some skills and a wider understanding of some of the massive challenges caused by poverty worldwide, and really developed my sense of social justice. So then I thought, well, maybe this is the great thing I was going to do. I'm going to work for the United Nations or somewhere in the UN system. But I needed to go back to Procter and Gamble first because they'd funded this whole thing, and it was only for a year, and so I went back to London and worked in IT for another 18 months. But really, the contrast of like who can sell the most soap powder versus we're helping people not die of a disease of poverty that is curable. It's just how do we get the cure out to people? It really jarred with me, and I found it really difficult to care about the profit motive. So actually, WHO got in touch and offered me a job in the Philippines, and I went and worked there. But just before I left, I got together with my now husband, Chris. So we had 6 weeks of time together. And then at Valentine's Day 2004, he had to drop me off at Heathrow Airport in London as I flew off to the other side of Asia. And so kind of my heart wasn't really in it. I stayed 8 months and learned a lot about Pacific Islands and the tuberculosis there and China. And I'm very glad that I wasn't still there when COVID broke out, because it would have been my office in the Western Pacific that would have had to handle the initial liaison between China and the rest of the world at WHO. So fascinating time. But by the time I come back to the UK, I've got a boyfriend who I haven't seen for 8 months. Who doesn't live anywhere near where I'm from. He was from the Midlands in England, several hours away, which to people in the UK, a 3-hour journey is massive. It feels difficult. I know in the US, that's not so insurmountable an object. So I've got a boyfriend, I've got no job, I've got no career, I've got nowhere to live. I'm not feeling like I've achieved what I was supposed to achieve. So I moved back in at home here in Bradford, kept up my relationship with Chris. He'd been to the Philippines to visit. I'd come home once for my grandma's funeral and met up with him then. So we were making a go of that. But I really now I'm on that comma. I do not know what I'm going to do with my life. And I started to feel very much like I'd let everyone down. My parents had scrimped and saved to pay for me to go to private school, because I did go on a scholarship, but it was like a third discount on the fees. They still had to pay thousands of pounds a year. Having just got divorced and had to buy another house. So I really felt quite low about life choices. And looking back, I was in my mid-20s. I didn't need to worry. I had my whole life ahead of me. But at the time, it felt like a real letdown.
Can I jump in for just a moment? And I'll do that from time to time. If I'm ever like stepping in, you're like, no, wait, I have things I'm still trying to say, then push me back out again. I just wanted to kind of reflect and acknowledge a couple of things here. So, what I'm hearing so far in the story that you're sharing is kind of a couple of things, and you correct me where I'm wrong or if it's not quite accurate, but this sense of needing to know, what you were going to do with the rest of your life. And you're primarily talking about so far, like in terms of a profession, making a living and so forth. But I'm seeing what seems like this overwhelming sense of needing to know and needing to figure it out, combined with as long as I keep experimenting and trying things, then I'm moving forward. So definitely see this kind of adventurous, experimental sampler kind of, if you will, in you. Try it, learn. And then also still seeing this element of like trying to figure it out and being uncertain.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was so excited by the going to Switzerland and going to the Philippines, and I'd travelled, I'd gone interrailing around Europe, I'd been to the US and Canada after my first year at university, and seen a small part of that great continent. But it just became more and more like my friends are settling down, they're doing the barrister training or the legal training or the medical training, or they've got jobs in corporates, and I have no idea what I'm doing.
I was just gonna say, I just had a question, like, through this, you mentioned you're in your 20s, you've kind of walked us through some of the exploration so far. What was the drive behind it? Like, what was pushing you through, or maybe pushing isn't the right word, but what was the drive behind this search, this seeking? Like, what was going on for you at that time? What were you thinking?
Well, I think I realized that I needed to find a job that I really cared about.
Mm,
I tried the corporate world and didn't find passion there. And it was okay. There was a nice coffee machine and like I had a comfy office and got to travel. I went to the US a few times and various European destinations, but like business travel, it's not fun. It's not relaxing,
mm,
and you have to go to work the next day with jet lag and, um, 2 weeks in the big hotel I stayed in Cincinnati with like no social life because I didn't know anyone and nobody from the company lived in downtown Cincinnati.
mm,
It was lonely and a bit boring. So it sounded really glamorous, but it wasn't what it looks like when you're a young student going, oh, I want to get one of these great corporate roles. So I knew I needed something that would fill me with purpose or, that I felt aligned to doing. And WHO really did that. But the role in the Philippines was very junior. It was very well paid, but it was very junior.
mm,
And while I was, working for the elimination of a terrible disease that kills over 2 million people a year, even though there's a cure,
mm,
I wasn't able to really spread my wings. I was never going to get promoted because I wasn't a doctor. Most people at WHO are doctors, even in, roles that are nothing to do with medicine. They like to
mm,
hire doctors. I wanted to get back home and make this relationship with Chris work. So I think what I was looking for was a job with a real social justice bent to it that used my skills to the full, but that was in the part of the world where I wanted to be with my partner. I
mm.
couldn't think what I was going to do in the UK, with this classics degree.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had this really weird CV that most employees weren't going to touch with a barge pole.
So let me jump into the second question of our 5 questions, and you can go back and forth and continue to tell the story. But I kind of want to introduce this at this point. So, so far, you're kind of at this point now. You've been on this journey. You're searching. You're seeking. Now you've got this burgeoning relationship of 8 months, and ready to start investing in that. I think when I jumped in earlier, you were at the point of, okay, I am kind of re-anchoring myself again. What did sitting on this comma create for you is the second question.
Well, it made me look at what I wanted in life. So in some respects, I kept looking back and thinking, God, why didn't I just train as a solicitor, like a different lawyer that we have in the UK? That would have been quite easy to do that. But I really wanted to be a barrister and stand up and argue in court. I didn't want to do the behind the scenes work that solicitors do. So it's much easier to train as a solicitor and much cheaper. But I'd been quite confident that I wanted to be a barrister, and if I couldn't be a barrister, I didn't want to be a lawyer at all. So there was a lot of regret and looking back and thinking, oh, you need to start making some practical, pragmatic choices and not just going, oh, that sounds great, that international opportunity, let's go. It also made me think about my role, my position as a woman, as a feminist, because I'd kind of, in one telling of the story, I'd come home because of a man and given up my career. That's not quite how I see it or saw it at the time, but I did think, what if this relationship doesn't work out, or am I at risk of? There was definitely an element of sort of saying to Chris, why don't I just move in with you, and we could just have kids now while I haven't got a career, and then I'll have one afterwards. He always wanted. He was a primary school teacher. And he always wanted to be the main carer. When he had children, this was a purely theoretical conversation at this point.
Because y'all aren't even married yet, or haven't made a significant commitment. Yeah.
So there was a time when I was like, look, we're young. I know none of our friends are having kids yet, but let's just settle down and have children now. And that would solve where do I live? I don't need a job anymore if I'm doing that. I can have a career later. We kick that can down the road. We'll be parents while we're young and energetic. And he was like, whoa. We got together, did a long distance relationship from London to the Midlands, because I was living in London. He was living in the Midlands before I went to the Philippines. We did that for 6 weeks. You then went to the other side of the world. We've seen each other twice in 8 months, and you want to get married and have kids now just to solve some logistical issues around your situation. He's a lot more I'm very impulsive. I mean, it's subsequently it appears that I probably have ADHD and I'm awaiting assessment for that. But at the time I didn't know that. But I was just like, but this is, this is perfect. But I was being really impulsive. And he and I are like yin and yang. He's like the opposite. He's very thoughtful and methodical and thinks things through. So fortunately, he was able to say, I'm not going to go along with this plan. So yeah, what it brought me was really, it forced me to reflect on what do I want out of life, and you can't always have what you want. You can't always just be all enthusiastic. So I said I'm enthusiastic. I can often sort of bounce people into doing things, but luckily Chris was like, no, that's not going to work for me. He had some good boundaries there. So yeah, I just got stuck with this. Well, what do I do now? But it really made me reflect and make some. I then made some better choices, shall we say?
Okay. Tell us a little bit about those before I go into the next question, because it feels like, that's kind of the natural progression of your story. It's like, so here I am sitting on this comma, and then.
So what happened next was I was back home living with my mum, who was living next door to my dad and stepmom. Long story. So I had lots of time with family to talk things through. And eventually I, decided, despite their wise counsel, that I was going to train as a teacher. I still felt called to do that. I still felt that standing at the front of a room, helping kids learn, finding out what they know, helping them build on it. That's what I really wanted to do. So yeah, the next phase was when I became an educator.
So before I go to the next question, Lucy, you've been kind of talking about where you sat on a comma and what that created for you. Is there anything else about this kind of particular part of the story that needs to be told in order to fully express what that comma was like for you?
I will say one thing that links to what I'm going to say later is during the period when I was working at Procter & Gamble, so between Geneva and the Philippines, that was an 18-month period where for the first time, I remember very vividly, all my flatmates were people I went to university with, but they both had long-term partners and they were out with them a lot, and I was single. And I vividly remember that's when the first time I drank a whole bottle of wine by myself in front of the TV with a pizza, Saturday night, nothing to do. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I just drank a whole bottle of wine. That is extreme. That is poor behavior. This is not going to happen again. But spoiler alert, it did happen again quite a few times. But my enjoyment of alcohol had always been, just part of how I socialized. I'm from what in the UK is known as the ladette generation. So women young women in the 1990s, we were told we can have it all. You're going to go to university, you can have an amazing career, but you can also party like a man. You need to drink pints. In the UK, we drink these 568 milliliter units of beer. We all drank pints at university. I played football, soccer, I played cricket. I had a very brief dalliance with rugby, but that was terrible. We were sort of led to believe that we could just do whatever our male counterparts did. And the fact that we might one day want to have children didn't need to get in the way anymore because our generation were liberated. That version of feminism very much took hold while I was at Oxford and then was built on while I worked in the corporate world, because our whole generation was trying to live this work hard, play hard lifestyle.
So, well, it sounds like you're kind of introducing another element here too. On the one hand, you've been sharing with us this comma, sitting on a comma, about kind of figuring out, what to do in your life for a profession and a role and all of the exploration, everything. And now you're talking about then this role that alcohol played in that. How does alcohol fit into the story?
So at that time, it wasn't problematic in the sense that I was absolutely in line with my peers. We would drink absolutely loads on a Friday and a Saturday and probably not really drink in the week. It was very much a binge drinking culture. But I moved into teaching. I did my teacher training, which was tough. It was hard. But I did really enjoy the second school I trained in. They offered me a job. I was promoted very quickly So I worked there for 5 years and was, head of. So I trained to teach citizenship. I didn't want to teach classics because I didn't want to work in an independent fee-paying school, and that's mostly where Latin and Greek are taught nowadays in the UK. So I trained to teach citizenship using my UN experience. I had British government and politics A-level, so I had qualifications there. So I went into teaching citizenship, which is like civics, law, human rights kind of topics. Absolutely fascinating. So I got promoted quite a few times, moved schools, got promoted another couple of times. Chris and I got married by this point. We got married in 2010. And just through that period, the drinking started to drift upwards, again, in line with everybody else I knew. It was like, oh, I'll have a glass of wine after work on a Thursday because it's nearly the weekend. It's like the pre-weekend. And then it was a couple on Thursday and one on Wednesday. But many other people were doing the same thing. So it's not really, I didn't consider my drinking problematic at this stage at all. But definitely life was getting more stressful, and I was definitely leaning a little bit on alcohol and really looking forward to Friday night, because that's when the kind of limitless, drinking can begin. But then I got pregnant with my daughter I had 2 miscarriages, which was tough. Like, nobody was talking about it back then. I didn't know, I didn't realize, I didn't think I knew anyone who'd had a miscarriage. So when it happened to me, I was absolutely shocked. Why me? But then when I opened up to friends, family about it, it turned out there was almost more people had one than not. But even though we thought we were this liberated generation of women, we hadn't been talking about this. It was a big taboo. So drinking probably ramped up a little bit then, because obviously one of the things you're not going to do when you're in the early stages of pregnancy is drink alcohol. And I do remember actually thinking, well, at least I can have a drink, which is doesn't reflect that well on my state of mind at the time. So I had 2 miscarriages in between getting married and having my daughter. So that's over a couple of years period in the early 2010s. But then got pregnant with my daughter. Everything was fine, really easy pregnancy. But the National Health Service advice here at that time was that pregnant women could, after the first trimester of pregnancy, you could drink 2 units of alcohol twice a week.
Wow.
On a Wednesday and on a Saturday, I would measure out my 2 units of wine. I would get these small bottles that you can get. And I would ritually enjoy my 1 glass of wine, like I didn't even manage to give it up completely for the 9 months of my pregnancy. And another quite telling story to do with alcohol is that I remember one time I got my small bottle of wine and it was a different brand from usual. And I poured it into my glass and was like, that's not as full as it usually is. And I looked at the bottle, and instead of the usual 250 ml of alcohol, which I now realize potentially was slightly more than 2 units, but back then I thought that was 2 units. It was 187 milliliters, and I was furious. I was horrified. I have been diddled of my treats, that is not a sign of a healthy relationship with alcohol, is it? A person being really cross that her little bit of alcohol that she's measuring out like it's medication, that it's a slightly smaller dose than usual. So at the time, I didn't think anything of it. I thought this was perfectly normal attitude, that this, like if I'd paid for a large piece of cake and only got a small one, But looking back, I realized that was not a sign of a healthy relationship with ethanol. But my daughter's healthy and well, fortunately. It doesn't seem, we don't know, you never know how your child would have been had you conducted yourself differently, but she's thriving and happy and healthy so far. And then I had my son a couple of years later, and luckily, 2 healthy, happy children. So then we were in London. My husband was a deputy head teacher by this point, and I was a head of humanities, head of faculty at a large secondary school. But even on 2 really good salaries, there was no way we were going to be able to live in a house. We lived in a flat above a shop, which we owned with a mortgage. but there was no way we were going to be able to afford an actual house with a garden and, places to park the car and things like that. So we decided to move back up north here to Bradford, where house prices are really, really cheap because of the economic situation of the region. And that move was very hard on my husband. So he had gone through various difficulties at work to do with the fact that he wanted to be the main carer for our daughter. So he split the parental leave with me. I had 4.5 months parental leave when I was, maternity leave, and he had the other half of the 9 months you're allowed, which was a relatively recent innovation in the UK back then. And men were not taking that up. So even though it was a primary school, mainly staffed by women, it went down like a lead balloon when he said, I would like to take 4.5 months parental leave. They were like, what? And he was like, I'm a modern man. Is this not good? They were like, well, we weren't banking on that. We weren't expecting that. We haven't budgeted for that. And he was like, well, that's not really my problem.
Yeah.
I'll do it. So then he gave them as much notice as we could, but you can't announce a pregnancy, especially when you've had miscarriages, until things are as good, as safe as they can be. So that had led to bad feeling. And then when he wanted to go back part-time, they wouldn't let him be deputy head anymore. So I think that had really knocked his confidence. And he'd done some supply teaching and worked in some different schools just to kind of get out of there. And then we obviously had to find a new job when we moved up north. So we moved up, so we had a baby and we were making this massive move, and he'd had all this career upheaval, and his mum, who he was really close to, had been diagnosed with cancer, and she sadly passed away about a year after we moved here. So we moved here in February, and in September, unfortunately, Chris had quite a major mental health crisis. Very severe anxiety and depression. He was unable to work. He was sort of non-functioning some of the time, just in bed, couldn't. And I'd gone back to work. I'd got a new job as well, in a new school in a really challenging community. Fantastic school, really well run, but in a really challenging part of Bradford. So I'm trying to impress at this new prestigious school, very emotionally draining. He's at home with a 2-year-old and a baby, and I'm not sure how well everyone's needs are being met during the time I'm out of the house. So that was a really tough time, and that's when the drinking took off. My husband would fall asleep very early, so we'd get the kids to bed. He'd go straight to bed like 6:30, and I'd just start on the red wine. And I didn't drink that much, like Monday and Tuesday, but by Wednesday, I was worn down. I was tired. I was really distressed about how Chris was doing. It was really hard to get any help from him because he wasn't suicidal. And the NHS here is amazing, but they're not resourced for swift responses to non-emergencies. Let's put it that way. So it was really hard to get any help. We'd lost his salary. After a while, he decided to resign rather than claiming any more sick pay, even though he was entitled to loads more. He didn't feel right taking public money from the education system to stay at home, even though he really needed that time. So financial problems, health problems, not sure the kids are being looked after properly, can't afford to get any help with that, and trying to do a really tough job on top. And it was just really hard. So there was a couple of years where I was drinking every night. And one of the ways I saw to get out of some of this stuff was like, I could get promoted. I could go from being a 4 days a week main scale teacher in the classroom. I'd got head of department and gone full time as soon as I had the option to just try and get a bit more money in. But I kind of got stuck on another comma at this point because I really wanted to get back to the career level I'd been at as head of humanities. I'd taken a step right down to be part-time and classroom teacher because I wanted to be with the kids while they were small and things like that. And Chris, we were expecting him to have some income as well. But, I just needed to earn some more money. And I started to get a little bit frustrated after a couple of years of kind of looking for promotion. And it just didn't seem like the school were going to promote me. They brought in younger people from kind of fast track schemes and things like that. And I just kind of realized that they really wanted to be staffed by these young, hungry people. And even though I was only about 35, I'd kind of missed the boat. It was a very forward thinking schools trust group of schools. And it just wasn't going to happen. I was really frustrated about that. And I was half kind of drinking. As Chris got better and better, I just carried on drinking because I was frustrated. I was kind of drinking at the work situation. It brought back all these things about I'm only a teacher, I'm only a head of department. What happened to I'm going to be prime minister? What happened to if you're a good girl and do all the
Yeah.
right things, you get the gold star. I'm working so hard here. I'm juggling all the plates. And yet I'm stuck. I can't progress.
Yeah. Lucy, let me jump in for a moment and ask the third question, because I know you've got a couple of stories that are kind of unfolding here. The third question is, as you look back at these commas that you were sitting on, what were you learning about yourself at this time?
With certainly the second time when I was in a job that I could not afford to, I desperately wanted to just quit and do something else and be very impulsive and kind of, again, potentially an ADHD trait. But I did have the self-control to realize that would just financially crash, my family situation. But I found it unbelievably difficult to get up and go to work every morning, to leave my husband and kids who could really have benefited from me being there, to go and do a job where I felt I wasn't recognized. Like I really need the recognition. So this time I'm doing good work. I'm working in a deprived community. I'm educating young people who might not have got a great education, had people with good qualifications and experience like me, not been willing to go and work in those more challenging areas. But I wasn't being recognised by the senior colleagues in the way that I would have liked. So I realised that I need that pat on the head that I used to get as a schoolgirl. I need to go, you've done so well. You're going to do great things. Turns out I need that, or I needed it back then.
That seems like it's a thread that's kind of run all the way through with your exploration and your kind of looking at different types of opportunities for how to make a living and all of the experimentation with different roles. It seems like that need for recognition also was kind of a thread that ran through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was really frustrated by not having that and got quite bitter, quite. And, I was literally I think the third oldest teacher in the school in my mid-30s. The leadership were incredible people. The head was this amazing visionary who's now the CEO of the trust. But they were really young, similar age to me. And yeah, basically I realized in the end that, and I felt like I can't take a risk and go and try and get a promotion externally because I just don't have the energy to go through a recruitment process. I've got these kids that I need to look after. I've got my husband I need to care for. I'm trying to, use as much family support as I can. And my extended family were amazing. We wouldn't have got through it without them. But I just don't have it in me to go home one night and write an application for a senior position, which will be really hard to get. But in the end, I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, I have to do this. I have to move on. They're not going to promote me. I'm not going to stay here being embittered and stuck forever.
It sounds like another thing that you learned through this is started to learn something around limits is what's coming up for me.
Yeah. And looking back from 10 years on from there, I now know about myself that I cannot tolerate not being fulfilled for long. I don't know if it's an ADHD kind of thing of like I need more dopamine than I would get from a very frustrating job that isn't challenging me and where I'm not getting any, approbation or whatever you want to call it from leaders. But I've found it very hard to stay in roles where I'm not happy. A job came up at a sister school within the same group of schools. That was the flagship school. It was the original school in the trust, the first one that was set up. And it was perfect for me. Assistant principal, staff development. So I'd be teaching other teachers, which really appealed. And I'd done some of that as kind of side projects and things that I tried to do to get more experience. Anyway, I managed to secure that job. It was my absolute dream job.
Mm.
Absolute right school, right head teacher to work for. You know, everything was perfect. So I transferred to them in the summer of 2019. So it was like August, September 2019. I started working there. And at this point, the drinking has calmed down. Chris is feeling a lot better. He's still not working securely, but he's doing some supply teaching. You know, he's got a bit of money coming in. He's functioning again. The kids are feeling, you know, the kids' needs are being met better. Things are starting to look really good. And then I've got this promotion, so the money thing is solved. It's brilliant.
It's such a journey here, all these details that you're sharing with us and this experience of kind of exploration and then, this evolution of your life, the building of your family, and kind of starting to come down the road of starting to figure out what you wanted to do for a living. And then meanwhile, there's this other thing that you've been carrying with you all along the way is the drinking. And it sounds like that's coming to a head. What else would you share with us about that?
So it came to a head. There was no massive rock bottom, but it did come to a head between me starting that fantastic new job and the Christmas of that year. So this kind of 13-week period. There was an incident where some friends came to visit from like 5 hours away from far in the south of the UK. And I was too hungover from the night before to enjoy my time with them. I dragged myself out, but everywhere we went, I had to go to the toilet and like vomit and sort myself out. It was awful. It was such, it was such a missed opportunity to show them where I live and the places I love. And I couldn't be really present with them and their kids who were visiting. Then there was another incident where the week we were breaking up from school for Christmas, I drove my younger colleague, who I always drove to work. She didn't have a car. And we'd been on the senior leadership night out the night before, myself and my colleagues, not her. And we'd stayed out till about midnight, and I had like a couple of Negronis after drinking a lot of wine, and then got up at 6:45 and picked up my colleague at like 7:30 to drive to school for the last day of the school year. So I've survived my first term as an assistant principal. And we drove to Costa Coffee on the way there to get like a celebratory breakfast. And while we're in the car park, I just did not see this random piece of curb, and I just drove right over it. And it didn't do any damage to the car, but I realized I was still drunk. I was drink driving, something I prided myself on, but this was morning after the night before. And I realized that not only had I put myself and other road users in danger, I had a colleague in the car, a friend, and it was not okay. So that was a real revelation that things had gone too far. So yeah, I started to really think about it. And then basically from there on, the decision to go sober was really, really easy. I drank through Christmas because I don't know, I felt like last hurrah. A relative who I considered to be a problematic drinker themselves at one point said, "Are you having another drink?" On the 27th of December, as I was having like a third massive gin and tonic and sort of thinking, I really need to stop doing this. And that pushed me over the edge. I was like, right, Google is coming out. I'm downloading all the Quitlet and all the books. I didn't really know about podcasts then, but I downloaded Alcohol Explained by William Porter, read about the brain chemistry, realized why I was so stuck, and said, right, New Year's Eve, that's it. I'm going to have my glass of champagne just before midnight, and I'm never going to drink alcohol again. And I haven't.
Wow. Well, that's the segue into the next question, right? Which is what's changed for you as a result of sitting on these commas? And I want to kind of like bring it back because you've really kind of shared with us, and obviously your life is very rich and complex. But in today's conversation, you've shared with us kind of this figuring myself out or figuring out what I want to do with myself for a living, and the journey with drinking. So when you look at those commas, what's changed for you as a result of sitting on those commas?
Well, first things first, I gave up alcohol on the 1st of January 2020, and then COVID, we went into lockdown here in the UK on the 23rd of March. So number one, I'm not sure whether I'd be here today, if I'd have had lockdown as an opportunity.
Mm.
I'm very, very grateful because it really was ramping up. So first of all, it enabled me to deal with COVID. I was on it. I was full of energy. I was sleeping really well. I didn't realize why I kept sleeping until 3 a.m. and then waking up and like ruminating on negative thoughts. Like I didn't realize that's something alcohol does to you. I now know that.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of sleep, health, my physical appearance, I just felt so much better. And I found the energy to exercise, which I hadn't really done since university when I'd played all this laddish football and stuff. So I ended up getting into triathlon.
Mm.
And I'm now a qualified swimming teacher, swimming coach, triathlon coach, cycling coach, and run leader. So I do all of those things in a voluntary capacity, and compete to a very low standard myself every now and then. So I discovered exercise, particularly endurance sports. I'm not fast, but I can keep going for a long time and enjoy a lot of landscape while trail running and things like that. So that has been the biggest thing that sobriety has given me. It's given me my headspace back. I don't have to sit and negotiate from like 2 p.m. How much are we drinking? Where are we going to get it from? Is it too much? Is it normal? Am I an alcoholic? All that is gone. I have so much more energy. My sleep is amazing. I was much more effective as a school leader and supporting our community through COVID, where there were all sorts of issues with people not having enough food. It was because of the entrepreneurialism of people in Bradford. They had small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
When they lost when lockdown came, they lost their income.
Mm.
It was really, really tough, but I was so much more effective at school, and as a parent and as a wife, and started to see the situation I'd put myself and Chris in, since Chris had always wanted to be the main carer for our kids. And I'd kind of basically gone, well, as a feminist, I just don't think I should have to do loads of housework. I just put it all on him.
Mm.
And then when he was ill and he was at home, as he started to get better, he really started to do more and more of it to a higher and higher standard, until I was like, well, this is brilliant. And all I'd done is made myself into a 1950s man. I just didn't even think about it. Every now and then I'd be like, this dish isn't very clean. Like, how dare I? So I started to be able to see some of the negative patterns I'd got into, and I won't say they're completely reversed, but Chris and I have conversations about them now, and I'm still working on that. But I've developed my understanding of a fair division of labour in the home. And then when a few years later, I did actually end up burning out as a school leader, and I think, to an extent, I've been medicating ADHD with alcohol, as well as anxiety and concern about my life situation. So then I medicated it with endurance sport. And eventually that became unsustainable. Like, I was getting up at the crack of dawn to exercise. A colleague had a stroke, and I was given a big chunk of her responsibilities when I was already kind of heading for the edge of burnout myself, as schools in the UK have had their budgets cut massively, just like everywhere else. And it just got more and more difficult as we lost staff and resources, and as children's mental health got worse, as it has done since COVID. So I ended up saying, I can't do this anymore. But rather than going off sick, I caught it in time and just said, I'm going to go part-time. Financially, we could cope for a while. I went part-time, trained as a sober coach with the Sober Club and Janie Lee Grace, which has been absolutely incredible, being able to help people and give back to others, because I had been a coach for teachers, so I had some coaching skill. So I built up my coaching practice over the last year, and also became an academic coach for sporty teenagers. And then just recently, I have been able to secure a part-time job teaching classics.
Yeah.
Back to my first love. At an absolutely fantastic school that I've only been there a couple of weeks, but it's been wonderful so far. So yeah, I've managed to find a professional balance that works with my busy brain. I've got my two businesses, I've got my steady job, for income and human contact, because the other roles are both on Zoom. And I'm also director of Sober Butterfly, which is a community interest company. We help connect people who want to socialise without alcohol, and I do some work for them as well.
Nice. Well, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to acknowledge those in just a few moments. So it sounds like you kind of come full circle, this journey of exploration and experimentation and kind of self-discovery, finding limits and boundaries. If you kind of bring it all together, briefly, question 5, like, how would you answer this question? What does getting off the comma look like for you? In a phrase or two.
Yeah, it looks like balance. It turns out I was seeking that one career that was going to make me happy, but there is no one thing for me.
Mm.
What I needed was multiplicity and balance between different types of work. So, it's helped me realize that the social paradigm that you have one career and you work really hard at that, that's not right for me.
Well, and through your story, what I notice is, all along the way, you challenge the norms and the paradigms. I mean, with the exception of kind of like comparing yourself to your peers with your drinking and am I doing what they're doing? So much of the rest of your career was, well, I'm going to go off and do these non-traditional things. So I could definitely see how that multiplicity shines through in your career. Lucy, thank you for sharing your story with us today. And it has certainly been an honor. There's certainly so much more we could explore. Where could people, if people wanted to learn more or connect with you, talk to you, see what you're up to, where could people find you? We'll put all of your links in the show notes. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, so my sober coaching practice is called Carnelia's. So I have a Carnelia's community as my handle for that on various social media, and my and there's Sober Butterfly is our sort of social enterprise, helping people connect and find other friends who want to socialize without alcohol. And I would also love to give a massive shout out to soberistas.com, which is a wonderful online community where I found absolutely invaluable support when I was giving up drinking, and doing their 100-day challenge was an incredible source of support. And that really helped me in my sober journey. And then finally, you can find me on the Sober Club Coaches Directory. So I am one of many, along with Paul, one of a range of fantastic sober coaches trained by Janie Lee Grace at the Sober Club, who, if you are, considering your relationship with alcohol, head over there. You will find someone who can support you.
Nice. And those are the acknowledgments. I so appreciate you adding those in as well. So, Lucy, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate you being part of our community today and sharing your story with us, and look forward to following your journey going forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Paul.
What an honor it is for me to witness these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way too. Think about what you learned from this conversation. What stood out for you? What challenged you? What inspired you? And I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling and reflection. Surprises can reveal themselves to you when you do this. And if you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. Let's spread the word. Let's continue to build connection. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Be sure to like this episode, follow the podcast here on this platform and social media at Off the Comma, and feel free to comment and interact with these posts and episodes. Check out my website for workshops, events, and my sponsor community. I'm covering the costs of production by curating my own sponsors who align with our vision. Be sure to check them out. They're all powerful people and businesses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.